The lawyer stopped reading. Just stopped. Mid-sentence. He looked up at my stepmother, then at me, then back down at the paper in his hands like he needed to read it twice before he could trust his own eyes. The room had been quiet before, but this was a different kind of quiet. The kind where you can hear the air conditioner humming and somebody's pen tapping against a folder 3 feet away. "There's a second will," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word second, like even he wasn't sure he was allowed to say it out loud. And that's when my stepmother's face went white. Not pale, white. Like someone had reached into her and switched off whatever had been keeping the color in her cheeks for the last 45 minutes of smiling and nodding. If you've ever sat in a room and felt the exact second something starts to break, that was this room. That was this moment. And I had absolutely no idea, sitting there in a cheap plastic chair in a lawyer's office on a Thursday morning, that my entire life was about to split into a before and an after. Let me back up. Let me tell you how we got here, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what came before it. My name is Maria. I'm 29 years old, and for most of my adult life, I told myself that the way my family treated me was normal, that every family has an outsider, that every family has someone who sits a little further from the center of the photo. My father, Walter, was the kind of man who built things with his hands and his patience. He started his logistics company with 1 truck when he was 26, driving it himself most nights, sleeping in motels along the interstate, and by the time he was 50, he had a fleet of 40 trucks and a warehouse that employed almost 60 people. He was proud of that company, in the quiet way some men are proud of things. He never bragged about it, but he kept a photo of that very first truck on his office wall, faded and curling at the corners, right next to a much newer photo of the full fleet parked in rows. When I was 12, my mother had already passed. Cancer. Fast and brutal, the kind that takes someone in under a year. And about 18 months after that, my father married Renata. I want to be fair here, because I spent years trying to be fair about this, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Renata wasn't cruel in obvious ways. She didn't yell, she didn't hit. What she did was smaller, and somehow worse. She had a way of rearranging a room so that I was never quite in it. Family photos where I'd be asked to scoot over just a little until I was at the very edge of the frame, half cut off. Birthday celebrations that would somehow always land on a weekend I was busy with something she'd arranged without telling me about the conflict until after. Holidays where Sophie, her daughter from a previous marriage, 2 years younger than me, got the seat next to Dad at the table, and I got the end, near the kitchen door. I used to ask my father if he noticed. He'd get this tired look on his face, rub the back of his neck, and say, "Danny, you're imagining things. Renata loves you like her own." I wanted to believe him. I think some part of me still wanted to believe him, even standing in that lawyer's office years later. 3 years ago, my father started getting sick. It began as fatigue he blamed on age, then trouble breathing, then a diagnosis that none of us wanted to say out loud in full. A slow, degenerative heart condition that the doctor said would eventually take him, just not on any predictable schedule. Somewhere in that first year of his illness, Renata started helping him with his affairs. That's the phrase she used, every time, like a script. Helping with his affairs, taking over the bank accounts, handling the company's financial paperwork, sitting in on meetings with his accountant that, conveniently, I was never invited to. I started noticing things I couldn't quite explain. A transfer here, a withdrawal there, numbers that didn't match the company's normal cash flow patterns I'd grown up understanding just from being around the business my whole life. I brought it up to my father once, gently, and I'll never forget the way Renata answered before he even opened his mouth. "Your father trusts me completely," she said, smiling in that calm, patient way she always smiled when she was telling you something was none of your business. Why don't you? And what was I supposed to say to that? Accuse my dying father's wife of something I couldn't prove? So I let it go. I let it go for almost 2 years, telling myself I was being paranoid, telling myself grief and illness make people suspicious of everyone, even when there's nothing to be suspicious of. My father passed away 7 months ago. It was quiet in the end. A Tuesday night in his sleep. The doctor said his heart simply gave out, the way they'd warned us it eventually would. The funeral was small, exactly the way he would have wanted it, except for one detail that felt very unlike him. Renata hired a videographer to remember him properly, she said, dabbing at eyes that I swear were dry until the camera pointed her way. I stood near the back during the service. Sophie didn't look at me once. Not during the eulogy, not during the burial, not during the reception afterward, where people I barely knew kept telling me how sorry they were for my loss, while Renata moved through the room like she was hosting a gala. 2 weeks after the funeral, the call came. Mr. Holloway's office, downtown, Thursday at 10 in the morning, for the reading of the will. I almost didn't go. Some tired, defeated part of me had already decided I knew exactly how this would play out, and going just felt like signing up to watch it happen in person instead of hearing about it secondhand. But something, call it instinct, call it 7 months of swallowing my pride at my own father's funeral, told me I needed to be in that room. The office was small, lined with law books nobody had probably opened in a decade. The kind of dusty, formal room designed to make ordinary people feel like something important was happening. It was just the 4 of us. Me, Renata, Sophie, and Mr. Holloway, a tall, careful man in his 60s, who had handled my father's legal affairs for almost 20 years. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began reading in that flat, practiced lawyer voice that strips all emotion out of even the most emotional sentences. The house at Birchwood Lane, valued at $1.2 million, to my wife, Renata. She nodded slowly, the way you'd nod at receiving an award you'd already been told you'd won. The vehicle collection and remaining liquid assets, approximately $400,000. To my stepdaughter, Sophie. Sophie looked up from her phone for the first time that morning, a small, satisfied smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. Then, Mr. Holloway got to my part. He paused, just slightly, just long enough that I noticed it, even though I couldn't explain why at the time. To my son, Daniel, another pause. I leave the storage unit at Crestline Self-Storage, Unit 114, and its contents. That was it. A storage unit. I sat there in silence while Renata let out a small, satisfied breath through her nose. Not quite a laugh, but close enough that I felt it land somewhere in my chest like a slap. Sophie didn't even bother hiding her smirk this time. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I just nodded, thanked Mr. Holloway, and walked out of that office like a man accepting a quiet, dignified defeat. But something about the way Holloway had avoided my eyes during that one line, something about that small pause before storage unit, sat wrong in my stomach the entire drive home. 2 days later, my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, the way you do with unknown numbers these days. But something made me pick it up. Daniel, this is Marcus Webb. I'm an attorney, not the family attorney you met with. A separate one your father hired about 18 months ago. I need to see you, in person, alone. His voice was calm, but deliberate. The voice of someone choosing every word carefully. I sat across from him the next morning, in a much smaller, much less impressive office than Holloway's. Just a desk, 2 chairs, and a single window letting in gray morning light. He slid a thick folder across the table without much ceremony. Your father came to me 18 months ago, Marcus said. He told me he no longer fully trusted the will that had been drawn up through Holloway's office, the one you heard read 2 days ago. He said, and I want to quote him directly because I wrote it down at the time, she thinks she's already won. Let her think that a little longer. Inside that folder was a second will, properly drafted, properly witnessed, properly notarized, dated 4 months after the one Holloway had read aloud. In it, my father left me 70% ownership of the actual company, not the house, not the cars, The business itself, the trucks, the warehouse, the real income-generating asset he'd spent his entire life building. But Marcus wasn't finished. He explained that my father had grown suspicious of Renata's behavior almost 2 years before he died, long before I'd even started noticing the strange numbers myself. Transfers to an account that didn't belong to her, payments, recurring, monthly, to a man named Curtis that nobody in our family had ever heard of. My father, sick and increasingly desperate to understand what was happening with his own money, had quietly hired a private investigator. What that investigator found was almost too much to process sitting in that small office. Renata had been planning to leave my father for over a year, after draining as much as she reasonably could without raising obvious alarms. She'd been seeing someone else, this Curtis, the entire time my father was getting sicker. My father found out, and instead of confronting her, instead of a messy, public divorce that could have tied up the company in litigation for years while he was dying, he did something quieter, something far more deliberate. He protected what actually mattered.
"He didn't tell you any of this while he was alive," Marcus said, "because he didn't want you walking into that will reading carrying anger on your face. He wanted them comfortable, confident. He wanted them to laugh at the storage unit, Daniel. He told me that almost word for word." That's when it hit me, sitting there, the folder still open in front of me. The storage unit wasn't an insult. It was a setup. I drove straight from Marcus's office to Crestline Self-Storage, Unit 114, my hands tighter on the steering wheel than they needed to be. Inside, it wasn't much to look at from the doorway. Old filing cabinets, a few boxes of company records going back over a decade, the kind of unremarkable clutter you'd expect from a man who never threw anything away. But tucked behind the cabinets, half hidden under a moving blanket, was a small, fireproof safe. Inside it, the original signed copy of the second will, a flash drive containing every financial document proving Renata's transfers to Curtis, bank statements, wire confirmations, even printed emails the investigator had recovered, and underneath all of it, a single folded piece of paper in my father's handwriting. "Daniel, if you're reading this, it means you went looking instead of walking away quietly. That's exactly who I raised you to be. The company is yours. Don't let her question it. I made sure there's nothing left to question. I'm sorry I couldn't fix things while I was alive. I made sure I could fix them after. I love you, son. Dad." I sat on the cold concrete floor of that storage unit for a long time after reading that letter. A week later, Marcus filed the second will with the probate court. Renata was notified by certified mail. No dramatic courtroom scene, no shouting. Exactly the kind of quiet, undeniable justice my father had engineered from beyond the grave. She showed up at the company's office 3 days after receiving that notice, furious, demanding to know what was happening, demanding explanations from me like I owed her any. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply slid the folder of financial records across my desk, the same way Marcus had slid it across his to me. "You can keep the house," I told her. Calm, steady. Dad made sure of that. He wasn't trying to leave you with nothing. But the company stays exactly where he wanted it to stay. She didn't have a response. There wasn't one to give. Sophie never spoke to me again after that. I never needed her to. 6 months later, the company is doing better than it ever did under Renata's so-called management. I kept my father's old office exactly the way he left it. The faded photo of that first truck still hanging on the wall, right next to the newer one of the full fleet. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that day in Holloway's office. The small, satisfied laugh Renata let out the second she heard the words storage unit. How certain people show you exactly who they are in the precise moment they believe they've already won. My father didn't fight for respect while he was alive. He simply made sure the truth couldn't be ignored once he was gone. And honestly, looking back now, that's the kind of justice that hits the hardest. Not the loud kind, not the kind with shouting and slammed doors, but the kind you never see coming until it's already done, signed, sealed,